The courage to be yourself, the essential balance between the ego and the unconscious. A journey of self-knowledge from the perspective of Jung and Buddhism. Imagine your consciousness as the captain of a ship. This consciousness, which we will call the ego, is the command center, present since your childhood. It makes daily decisions, plans the future, and deals with external reality. But just as a ship has a deep and often unexplored hold, your mind also possesses a vast submerged world, the unconscious. This unconscious is like a reservoir of experiences, memories, instincts, and desires that you cannot directly access. Sometimes it produces messages or products such as dreams, memory lapses, strong emotions for no apparent reason that rise to the surface. The problem is that these products, because they arise from a hidden place, may seem strange or even contrary to the tendencies and desires of your ego. It's crucial to understand that, for a healthy development, the ego and the unconscious need to be treated with equal respect and importance. Think of it this way. If the ship's captain, ego, completely ignores what's happening in the hold, unconscious, sooner or later the ship may run into serious trouble. Just as the conscious mind of a civilized person tries to limit and control the unconscious, often by repressing it, an unconscious that suddenly releases itself can be dangerous for the ego. It's as if the previously closed hold suddenly opens and floods the deck. Repression of the unconscious by the ego. You, as the captain, have a strong belief that successful people don't fail. When you feel afraid of failing in a new project, your ego may repress this emotion, saying, "I won't think about it. I'll just focus on success." This is a form of repressing the unconscious, fear. Unconscious dominating the ego. If this repressed fear becomes too strong, it can begin to appear in your life in unexpected ways. You may start to procrastinate, feel intense anxiety before important meetings, or even have nightmares about the project. In these cases, the released unconscious, the repressed fear, is dominating the ego and preventing you from taking action. The greatest danger here is losing serenity, that is, no longer being able to defend your own existence against the pressure of these unconscious emotions and impulses. This is something observed, for example, in the onset of schizophrenia, where the person may feel completely overwhelmed by internal content. This danger would be less if the confrontation with the unconscious were not so charged with strong emotions. Often, to avoid dealing with the emotional intensity that the unconscious can bring, people tend to aestheticize or intellectualize the situation. Aestheticization. You are going through a moment of great sadness, and instead of processing this emotion, you begin to write elaborate poems about it, or paint pictures with melancholy colors, focusing on the beauty of the sadness, but not on its root. It's a way of channeling affection into artistic expression without necessarily facing it head-on. Intellectualization. You're angry with someone, but instead of feeling and expressing that anger constructively, you begin to psychologically analyze the situation, seeking rational justifications for your anger or the other person's, distancing yourself from the feeling itself. These are excellent weapons for dealing with dangerous emotions in times of crisis, when your sanity or life is at stake. However, they shouldn't be used to avoid the responsibility of facing the unconscious. The confrontation with the unconscious needs to be multilateral. That is, it must involve all aspects of your personality. The affect, the emotion, must manifest itself in all its depth. Transformation and growth happen when you allow all parts of yourself to participate in this internal dialogue. Thanks to Freud, we know that the treatment of problems like neurosis, excessive anxiety, irrational fears, etc., must consider the emotional factor in its entirety. It's not a superficial water cure. It's a profound renewal of personality that affects all areas of life. Confronting the opposite, the unconscious, the parts of yourself you don't know or reject, is a serious and vital process. One of the essential requirements for this process is taking the opposite side seriously. This doesn't mean blindly accepting everything that comes from the unconscious, but rather giving it trust. You have a recurring, strange dream. Instead of simply dismissing it as meaningless, taking it seriously means pausing and trying to understand what it might be trying to communicate, even if it doesn't make logical sense at first glance. It could be that the dream is trying to compensate for a one-sidedness in your life, or pointing to an aspect you've been neglecting. By doing this, you allow the unconscious to cooperate with consciousness rather than simply disrupting it. Confrontation, therefore, not only validates the ego's point of view, but also grants equal authority to the unconscious. It's like an internal dialogue where the ego leads the conversation but allows the unconscious to also speak. Audiatur et altera pars. The other side is also heard. For some people, this other voice, the unconscious, is easier to perceive. They might, for example, write down their dreams and then respond to them from their conscious perspective, as if they were talking to a real person. It's a dialogue between two parties with equal rights, where each considers the other capable of presenting a valid argument. You feel compelled to do something that seems illogical but generates a strong sense of well-being, the other voice of the unconscious. Instead of immediately repressing this idea, you decide to dialogue with it. You ask yourself, where does this desire come from? What is it trying to tell me? How can I integrate this with my conscious plans? This voice may be pointing to a deep need that your ego has been ignoring, such as the need for creativity or a new challenge. This process of rapprochement requires effort and sacrifice from both parties, ego and unconscious. This dynamic is also reflected in therapy, where the analyst can assume the role of devil's advocate, helping the patient face and dialogue with the parts of themselves they resist acknowledging. It's surprising how difficult people have to accept the validity of the other's arguments, whether external or internal. This ability is fundamental to any human coexistence. If you don't recognize the value of the other, whether an external person or a part of yourself, such as the unconscious, you deny them their right to exist. The ability to have an internal dialogue is one of the basic criteria of objectivity. The unconscious doesn't always speak as clearly as in a dialogue. Sometimes it manifests itself through visual images, dreams, fantasies, visions that can be very eloquent to those who understand them, but a mystery to those who don't. In these cases, the ego needs to take the initiative and ask, what does this image of the cage mean to me? In what areas of my life do I feel trapped or limited? The answer can be profound and transformative, leading you to identify patterns of behavior or beliefs that imprison you. The alternation of arguments and affects between the ego and the unconscious forms what is called the transcendent function. This is when the tension between opposites generates something new and living. It's not an either-or, but a third element that emerges from the interaction. Think of it as a synthesis that elevates you to a new level of being, to a new situation. You are in an internal conflict between the desire for financial security, ego, and the desire to pursue an artistic passion that does not generate much money, the unconscious. The transcendent function is not about choosing one or the other, but about finding a creative solution that integrates both. Perhaps you start dedicating a few hours a day to art, or you find a way to monetize your passion without completely abandoning your security, creating a new path that previously didn't exist in your mind. When opposites are kept separate and conflict is avoided, they remain inert. Tension and confrontation are necessary for something new to emerge. At its core, this confrontation is about a consciousness that has become excessively one-sided, focused only on the ego, logic, and the material, and needs to connect with the totality and instinctive freedom of its being. It is as if the conscious mind were confronted with the ancestral and instinctive wisdom of the archaic man, or the anthropoid within us, which emerges from the darkness of the unconscious to compensate for and correct our one-sidedness. It shows us where we have deviated from our fundamental plan and where we have atrophied psychically. Describing the contents of the transcendent function is a complex task. There is a wealth of material, but clear conceptual foundations for expressing it are still lacking. Unfortunately, the scientific community often struggles to keep up with these ideas because they involve personal attitudes and prejudices. When people are swayed by their personal feelings, their judgments become subjective, and they tend to reject what doesn't apply to them or what they prefer to ignore. They may fail to understand that what applies to them may not apply to others with different psychology. We are still far from a universal explanatory framework. One of the greatest obstacles to psychological understanding is the indiscreet curiosity about whether a given psychological framework is true or correct. If an idea is not distorted or false, it is true by its very existence. Asking whether the platypus is a true or correct invention of the Creator's will is a form of childishness. Similarly, there is a prejudice against the role of mythologemes, archetypal patterns or narratives present in the collective unconscious in the human psyche. Many argue that because they are not true in the literal sense, they cannot fit into a scientific explanation. But mythologemes exist and influence our lives, even if their expressions do not fit our concept of absolute truth. Since the process of confronting the contrary element is total, nothing is excluded. Everything is involved in the discussion, even if consciousness only perceives fragments. Consciousness can be continually expanded by integrating previously unconscious content. However, this does not always happen. Even with the intelligence to understand the problem, we often lack the courage, self-confidence, or moral disposition to make the necessary effort. But when conditions are favorable, the transcendent function is not only a valuable complement to psychotherapy, it offers the patient the immense advantage of being able to actively contribute to their own healing process. Instead of relying exclusively on the analyst, the patient learns to free themselves through their own means and find the courage to be who they truly are. The depth of Jungian psychoanalysis finds remarkable parallels in the ancient practices of Buddhism. Both approaches, though distinct in origin and methods, converge on the central idea that the integration of the self, the harmonization between the conscious and the unconscious, and between individuality and wholeness, is fundamental to well-being and enlightenment. Buddhism, at its core, preaches the doctrine of anatta, no self or no soul, which postulates that the self or ego is not a fixed and permanent entity, but rather a fluid construct, an aggregation of physical and mental processes. This perspective resonates with the Jungian understanding of the ego as the center of consciousness, but not the entire psyche. For Jung, the ego is only one part of a larger system, and excessive identification with it can generate suffering. Vipassana meditation, mindfulness. Through attentive and non-judgmental observation of thoughts, sensations, and emotions, the Vipassana practitioner begins to perceive the impermanence of all phenomena. The individual gradually disidentifies from the constant flow of thoughts and feelings, realizing that I am not my thoughts, I am not my emotions. This weakens the ego's grip on its own narrative and allows other, previously repressed or unconscious contents to emerge and be observed without resistance. This practice is like Jungian confrontation, but viewed through the prism of impermanence and non-identification. The practitioner listens to the other side, their unconscious thoughts and emotions, without getting lost in them. Jung describes the danger of losing serenity in the face of the affective factors of the unconscious. Buddhism offers powerful tools for dealing with these affects, not through repression, but through acceptance and transformation. Negative emotions, anger, attachment, ignorance, jealousy, pride, are seen as poisons that cloud the mind, but not as something to be simply annihilated. Metta meditation, loving compassion, involves cultivating love and kindness for oneself and all beings. Rather than repressing anger or fear, the practitioner acknowledges them, feels them, and then sends compassion to themselves for feeling these emotions and to others who may be involved. This allows the affects to unfold all their values, as Jung suggests, transforming negative energy into compassion. Jung's aestheticization and intellectualization can be seen as ego defense strategies that Buddhism transcends through the wisdom of emptiness and the direct experience of emotion without attachment. In Jung's work, the shadow represents the repressed and unrecognized side of the personality, that which the ego refuses to acknowledge about itself. In Buddhism, the idea of recognizing and working with one's own imperfections, one's own mental poisons, is fundamental to the path to enlightenment. Working with the 5 aggregates, skandhas, Buddhism teaches that our experience is composed of 5 aggregates: form, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. By investigating each of these aggregates, the practitioner realizes how interdependent and impermanent they are, and how identification with them generates suffering. The shadow can manifest in any of these aggregates. For example, a repressed mental formation of anger, a poison, can be brought to consciousness and investigated without judgment, allowing its dissolution. This mirrors the Jungian idea of taking the opposite side seriously, recognizing and integrating the parts the ego tries to hide. Jung's transcendent function, which arises from the tension between opposites and leads to a new level of being, finds a profound parallel in the Buddhist concept of awakening or enlightenment. Awakening is not a state of denial of the world or suppression of emotions, but rather the ability to live in balance with the totality of experience, transcending the dualities, good, evil, right, wrong, pleasure, pain, created by the ego. The Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path outline the nature of suffering, dukkha, its origin, its cessation, and the path to cessation. Together, these elements represent a process of integral transformation that aims to harmonize all dimensions of the being, from the ego to the unconscious, and culminate in a state of wisdom and compassion, which can be seen as the new situation or new level of being of the transcendent function. The capacity for inner dialogue that Jung so values for objectivity is widely cultivated in Buddhism through introspection and self-observation. The idea of listening to the other side, be it the voice of the unconscious or the perspective of another, is intrinsically linked to the Buddhist understanding of interdependence. Reflection on the teachings, Dhamma Vichaya. In Buddhism, the practice of reflecting deeply on the teachings is not merely intellectual. It involves an investigation of reality that expands into the practitioner's own mind. By questioning and observing one's own reactions, beliefs, and prejudices, the practitioner develops the ability to listen to the inner voices, conscious and unconscious, without judgment, allowing wisdom to emerge. This openness to the other voice within reflects the understanding that everything is interconnected and that the separation between ego and unconscious is ultimately an illusion. The convergence between Jung's ideas and Buddhist practices demonstrates that the journey of self-knowledge and integration is universal, and can be approached through different paths that, at their core, seek the same goal, the wholeness and freedom of the self. Is there any further aspect you would like to explore in depth about this relationship between Jung and Buddhism?